Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Commissioner Tony O'Donnell from the state of Maryland, and I'm co-moderating today with Commissioner Kim Duffley of North Carolina. Thank you for joining our third DOE NARUC Nuclear Energy Partnership webinar. As co-chair of the partnership, along with Commissioner Tim Echols of Georgia, I'm pleased to welcome everybody to the discussion on prospects for nuclear energy in the Pacific Northwest and Puerto Rico. Today's webinar will be recorded with the recording and slides posted on NARUC's website and emailed to the attendees next week. In March of 2021, NARUC formally launched the 5-year Nuclear Energy Partnership with support from the Department of Energy Office of Nuclear Energy. Through this educational initiative, NARUC provides opportunities for state public service commissioners and commission staff to better understand barriers and possibilities related to the U.S. nuclear fleet, the nation's largest source of zero carbon power. We thank the Department of Energy, Office of Nuclear Energy for their support. Commissioner Duffley.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. I'm going to introduce our two speakers today. Our first speaker is Jesus Nunez. He is the CEO of the Nuclear Alternative Project. In this role, he maintains NAP's strategic vision and handles the day-to-day executive operations. He's also a senior structural engineer with Bechtel Corporation, working on the design and analysis of structures. He graduated from the University of Puerto Rico with a master's degree in civil engineering. We'll then hear from Arnie Olson. He is a senior partner at E3, where he helps clients navigate changes to bulk electric system operations and investment needs brought about by aggressive government policies promoting clean and renewable energy production. He has consulted extensively for utilities, electricity system operators, asset owners, developers, electricity consumers, and regulators. He has 25 years of experience in energy analysis, and he is a frequent speaker at energy conferences on the role renewable energy will play in decarbonizing the grid. Prior to joining E3 in 2002, he served for 6 years in the Energy Policy Division of the Washington State Energy Office. We thank you both for agreeing to speak today, and I'll turn the webinar over to Jesus.
Thank you, Kimberly. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jesus M. Nunez. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Nuclear Alternative Project. I will be presenting an overview of our nonprofit organization to you today. I would like to thank NARUC for giving me the opportunity to be part of this webinar. Next slide, please. My presentation will focus on the following topics: who we are, our work, feasibility study first steps, results from our feasibility study, current and future projects, and concluding remarks. Next slide, please. Who is NAP? NAP is a 501c3 nonprofit organization composed of reactor operators, engineers, consultants, and other professionals, all working in the U.S. nuclear industry. Our mission is to study the alternative of advanced reactors for Puerto Rico and resource-limited countries by educating the communities and their governments about their technological advances. Our approach, we adopted a strong community engagement approach. We are educating the communities first about advanced nuclear reactors and trusting that this transparent way of communication will result on an acceptance of a future advanced nuclear reactor project. Next slide, please. This slide shows NAP's board of directors. As I told you previously, my name is Jesus Nunez. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of NAP, but in my daily work, I work with Bechtel as a senior structural engineer. I have 13 years in nuclear structural design. To my right, Valerie Lugo, she's the Chief Operations Officer with NAP. She has 17 years entrepreneur and HR operations. Ramon Martinez is our Chief Nuclear Officer. He is a director with INPO. He has 20 years in nuclear operations, engineering, and maintenance. And Angel Reyes is our Chief Technology Officer. He's our SRO STA with Exelon, working in Culver Cliffs nuclear plant. He has 13 years nuclear engineering and operations. The work we do for NAP is voluntary because we believe this work can provide the community and the leaders in Puerto Rico with all the necessary information to make an informed decision about nuclear energy, especially SMRs and microreactors. Next slide, please. NAP is composed also of volunteers and an advisory board. NAP volunteers give their time and expertise to our organization. They are an important part of NAP structure. Our current volunteers are engineers and other professionals with various experiences in the US nuclear industry. NAP advisory board provide direction and recommend action plans to our leaders in a timely basis. They are formed by a group of engineers and other professionals with an intensive knowledge of the US nuclear industry. How our organization started? Next slide, please, sir. How our organization started? NAP was founded in 2015, late 2015, by a group of Puerto Rican engineers working in the US nuclear industry. It started with a question, how it is that no one is talking about advanced nuclear reactors to help solve Puerto Rico energy problems. Next slide, please. One of my favorite quotes was spoken by Roberto Clemente, a Puerto Rican baseball player. The quote says the following: if you have an opportunity to accomplish something that will make things better for someone coming behind you, and you don't do that, then you're wasting your time on this earth. And he did die helping others during an earthquake in Nicaragua. What we do in our organization, NAP brings Puerto Rican engineers and other professionals with the US nuclear industry to study the market viability, safety, and environmental impact of advanced nuclear reactors in Puerto Rico. NAP effort centers on the idea that as we do our work, we engage and inform the community in Puerto Rico and US stakeholders through the process. The NAP action model sets the foundation for potential future project development and local skill development. And we believe this is foundational for future sustainable development of advanced nuclear reactors in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. This is a flowchart showing our organization strategy. We engage with all the stakeholders shown in this flowchart to study and educate the option of advanced reactors for Puerto Rico. And like I said previously, this action sets the foundations for a potential future project developers and the potential of having a local labor skills in nuclear. Next slide, please. Nuclear energy is not new for Puerto Rico. It has been proposed for Puerto Rico multiple times. However, efforts have never been materialized. And as you can see in the diagram, I mean, it's kind of a summary of what happens is nuclear energy is proposed. The public raises technical questions. There is not a lot of experts in Puerto Rico to respond and resolve to these questions. And, you know, obviously the people that oppose to nuclear energy, they kind of put their terms into public opposition. And then the idea of nuclear is dropped by our leaders. Next slide, please. In our organization, we believe that educating the community of Puerto Rico about advanced reactors is essential. We trust that a well-informed community in Puerto Rico will respond in a similar way as the population surveyed in the picture shown. I can talk about my experience because I didn't have any knowledge about nuclear energy and the nuclear energy safety culture before joining Bechtel. My first project was to support nuclear operating plants in Georgia. And after I started working, it changed my perception about nuclear energy completely. And I mean, I didn't have any education on nuclear energy. And during my job, I could learn about it and I fell in love with it. And I think that is a solution that is feasible for the island. Next slide, please. How the idea of the feasibility study came into picture for our organization. Our leaders brought the discussion of SMR and microreactors for Puerto Rico by integrating the community, the nuclear industry, and local leaders and some interested stakeholders. We engaged with the local media during that process, answering some technical questions. And we noted that some of these questions needed further studies because we didn't know the answers because they were local to Puerto Rico. And that's why, as part of that, the state legislature passed a resolution 1189 to officially evaluate SMRs for Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. Not participated on the public hearings for that resolution 1189. We gathered feedback from the community, local leaders, and interested stakeholders about the most important topics which needed further studies. And we also received a letter from the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau demonstrating interest in the results of a potential feasibility study. And with all that information and with the letters from the local government officials and the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau, we submitted an unsolicited proposal for a feasibility study to the DOE-NE. And after some months, we did receive some funding from the Idaho National Lab to do the part of our study. Next slide, please. This slide presents the companies that help us out through the feasibility study and some individuals too that help us out. We have in the technical team, we have Arrow, Excel Services, McDonnell Valdez, Pacific Northwest. In our technical advisory board, we have Luis Reyes. One thing about Luis actually was one of the students of the first nuclear program in the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez. Next slide, please. The feasibility study focused on 7 main topics: the market conditions in Puerto Rico, the technology assessment, the public perception, grid assessment, legal and regulatory framework, financing, ownership, and operation mechanisms, and weighing the benefits and challenges for Puerto Rico. This study indicates that development of advanced nuclear reactors in Puerto Rico is feasible, but we end up with some questions from the public and local government that we needed to answer in the future. Next slide, please. Now I will show you some of the key findings of our study. The figure to the left shows the generation assets with the respective transmission lines. To the right, you can see how much metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent these power plants produce, as reported by EPA in 2018. Puerto Rico have aging power plants, and because of that, they have unplanned outages 12 times more than the US plants. And they are expecting to retire these 13 older plants within 10 years, and that's equivalent to 3,600 megawatts. Next slide, please. So the proposed PREPA IRP indicates that all energy generation in Puerto Rico will have to be produced from renewable sources by 2050. Therefore, investments in new power infrastructure other than non-renewable sources, but fossil and nuclear plants will have limited financial return period. We believe that by restricting private investment from non-renewable energy sources, this public energy policy seems to curtail private investment in Puerto Rico energy infrastructure when it needs it the most. Due to its tropical climate and isolated grid structure, Puerto Rico daily power demand and utilization rates are not expected to change appreciably. Therefore, the IRP's proposed high reliance on renewables needs like sufficient baseload capacity, such as LNG or nuclear reactors to support the power demand. However, only nuclear plants can complement the intermittency of renewable sources with zero emission baseload power generation. Next slide, please. As part of this study, over 3,000 residents of all ages and educational background were surveyed around the island. 94% of the residents were interested in continuing to explore the option of nuclear energy for Puerto Rico. And the residents rated their top priorities for power generation options. Number one, impact to health and environment. Number two, lower electricity bills. And number three, resistance to natural disasters. There is really an urgent need to provide the population and industrial sector in Puerto Rico with lower electricity costs and reliable electricity. Also, there's a need for job creations, and really we believe nuclear can create those jobs during the construction operation of the reactor, and it can provide some funding for local universities, like the University of Puerto Rico that I graduated from, that used to have a nuclear program in the 70s. And Puerto Rico can be part of the global leadership in this field, especially the Spanish speaking capability of Puerto Ricans. They can help the U.S. nuclear industry to work with places in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean that have the feasibility of having nuclear plants in the future. Next slide, please. SMRs, advanced nuclear reactors, can promote smaller and more distributed future generation plants. The installed capacity, like as you know, range between 50 and 600 megawatts, and the microreactors range between 1 megawatt and 20. And this make them suitable for Puerto Rico decentralized grid vision, and particularly the mini grids. In the picture, you can see two of the models that we study in our feasibility study. You have the NuScale SMR building, the Westinghouse eVinci microreactor, but also we study the GE Hitachi SMR and the X-Energy SMR. SMRs and microreactors can support the required retirement of around 74% of PREPA aging generation fleet, and expedient installation of new capacity to ensure a reliable grid and power supply. Next slide, please. The delivery of electricity from SMRs and microreactors can be cost competitive, as shown in our report, when we compare that with gas generation from combined cycle gas turbines proposed by PREPA as part of the island fleet replacement. As you can see, the picture shows the average cost of electricity in Puerto Rico in the different residential, commercial, industrial, and this cost is one of the highest in the U.S. States and territories. Next slide, please. The main concerns that Puerto Ricans have in terms of nuclear are the spent nuclear fuel disposal, what will happen with hurricanes and earthquakes, the resiliency of a nuclear plant for these natural phenomena, the high cost of new nuclear projects, as we know. Why is nuclear needed versus wind and solar? We get that question a lot. And what if there is an accident? We get that question a lot too. Next slide, please. After we submitted the proposal and we present the results, we still got some questions from the local leaders and from some community, and they want to know more information about it, specifically what will happen during a seismic event, what will happen during a hurricane, what is the emergency planning zone for these plants, for example. So we recently submitted a proposal to perform a site suitability study of 2 areas in the north part of the island. The study, if we get the funding, will answer some outstanding questions from the community and leaders in Puerto Rico, and will provide the nuclear industry with the technical information about nuclear in Puerto Rico and how different it is from or similar to any nuclear plant that is proposed here in the island, in the mainland. The site suitability will be based in US NRC Reg Guide 4.7 and some other documents that have some updates into that Reg Guide. And we will receive input from INDONIF and members and the US nuclear reactor vendors. Next slide, please. Our approach, like I said before, we have a fully integrated approach to the site suitability study, as we did for the first phase. We want to engage the community, the industry, the government, and the technology. And that's why I think nuclear could be an option to Puerto Rico, but we need to be transparent in the way we do our studies and we transmit our results to the public. Next slide, please. And in addition to the studies, we are developing webinars to educate the people of Puerto Rico about advanced nuclear reactors and other nuclear energy related topics. We have had some webinars already through the year, and we have tackled some of the big questions about nuclear energy for Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. And some concluding remarks. We believe a strong community engagement approach at a conceptual phase of a potential project is essential. And this is the importance of public opinion, which is critical in Puerto Rico. The public opinion in Puerto Rico is probably the most important aspect if a developer will want to put a nuclear reactor in the island. And also the communities need to be educated in a transparent way about the benefits and also the challenges of these nuclear energy projects. And we have found that technical and general questions from the community should also be answered in a timely manner to avoid misinformation and with people that are experts on the topic. Next slide, please. Also, we have found that obviously local culture and politics play an important role into how you are going to develop your educational campaign and how you are going to explain nuclear energy. The energy resiliency and reliability also are important variables to consider during the planning process. And this is important for Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico has a lot of manufacturing and critical infrastructure that we believe should have a mix of energy assets instead of only putting everything into renewables. And Puerto Rico economy depends highly on that heavy manufacturing. We believe countries and states should select an energy asset mix which optimize the cost of electricity, resiliency, reliability, and also it's scalable in case of a potential energy demand increase. Puerto Rico used to need more electricity than what they use now. Obviously, there are some manufacturing that has gone to other places in the world, but if this manufacturing comes back or they start having other industries that need a lot of energy, then that demand will increase again. Next slide, please. And we believe that a fully integrated approach between the community, industry, government, and the nuclear reactor technologies is essential to interest a potential nuclear energy, especially in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. With that, like we say in Puerto Rico in Spanish, gracias, thank you. Next slide, please. I want to show you, how to contact us. You can download our feasibility study for free in our webpage. And if you believe in our cause, you can donate on our website too. With that, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward for the questions.
Thank you so much. I see that we already have 3 questions in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those at the end of the meeting after hearing from Arnie Olson. And if you have questions for Arnie, please put them in the Q&A box while he's speaking. I'll turn it over to you, Arnie.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Duffley and Commissioner O'Donnell. Really excited to speak to you today about some of the work that we've done in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere about the potential role of nuclear in meeting long-run clean energy goals across the economy. So first, just want to check to make sure that everyone can see my slides.
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, perfect, great. So just a little bit of background about E3. We're a consulting firm with our headquarters in San Francisco, but we've got folks in Boston and in New York and Calgary and Raleigh-Durham as well. I do a lot of work in California. I've listed some of our projects that we've done here for the various agencies and energy companies, helping to understand how to meet California's aggressive clean energy policy goals. But we've also worked across the country. Our Net Zero New England study that we published last fall with the Energy Futures Initiative and Dr. Ernest Moniz was an exciting development for us and the Northeast. Upper Midwest I'll talk about as well, Colorado, Hawaii, et cetera. I'm going to give you some results from a study that we did with Energy Northwest. Energy Northwest, if you're not familiar with them, is a public power agency in Washington State that operates the Columbia Generating Station in the Hanford Nuclear Reservation there on the Columbia. So they were interested in understanding what are the optimal resource portfolios to achieve deep decarbonization in the Pacific Northwest. And specifically, how does the availability of firm zero-emitting generation, particularly nuclear, affect the cost of achieving these carbon goals and affect the reliability of it? And I think it's kind of and there's a link there if you want to go check out the full version of the study. And I think it's interesting that the Pacific Northwest has just very different conditions from Puerto Rico. So you've got kind of 2 ends of the spectrum here with regard to the grids. It's a winter peaking region. It's a region that's richly interconnected with other parts of the Northwest, other parts of the West, and with a base of hydroelectric resources that provide a lot of flexibility to integrate large amounts of wind and solar. So very, very different conditions, but in some ways very similar conclusions. So this study builds on a couple of previous studies that E3 had done in the Northwest that I've listed here. Our Pacific Northwest Low Carbon Scenario Analysis was published in 2018, looking at different policy options for achieving carbon reductions in the Northwest and finding that a mix of wind and solar and batteries and other resources is the best way to achieve those goals. But then a follow-up study to that was published in 2019 that focused on resource adequacy, both in the near term, given the significant coal retirements that we're seeing in the West and the changing weather, but also in the long run as our grid transforms. So this study really builds on top of those previous studies. And of course, what's happened since those studies were published is that Washington has gone on to adopt the Clean Energy Transformation Act. And there are a couple of provisions in there that are important to keep in mind. First of all, coal is to be eliminated from all utility portfolios in 2025. Secondly, by 2030, the utilities are to achieve net zero carbon emissions with at least 80% of retail sales served by zero-emitting generation. And then by 2045, 100% of retail sales are to be served with zero-emitting generation. So this really lays the groundwork for the utilities in Washington, now the legal framework for them to go off and invest and look at, discover, et cetera, the various clean energy options that are available. And Oregon has recently also passed some similar legislation. So just a little bit of detail about the study. We used E3's Resolve model, which is a capacity expansion and operations model. It co-optimizes investments and operations over time to minimize the cost of meeting both policy and reliability constraints. It's been used in a variety of other studies as well in a variety of regions. This slide lists the resources that we made available to the model as we projected out the Northwest's energy out through 2045. Hydro, of course, as I mentioned, something like 60% of the energy for the region comes from hydro today. Wind and solar and battery storage are obviously scalable, mature. Well, wind and solar are mature, and battery storage is getting there, but options that every study looks at. In addition to those options, we also wanted to zero in specifically on some of the nuclear options. So one of them was relicensing of the Columbia Generating Station. Another one was looking at small modular reactors. And here we used NREL cost data, but we also worked with NuScale to understand what their estimate might be of their nth of a kind resource and use that as a sensitivity. Then we made a couple of other zero emitting firm resources available, including biomethane, which is really just a stand-in for a fuel of any kind. It could be hydrogen. And then the last one was carbon capture and sequestration with natural gas generation. So we looked at various scenarios of resource availability to help understand what role each of these unique and different resources might play in the Pacific Northwest future. Just a word about resource adequacy before we dive into the results. This was the first study in the Northwest that had the benefit of a really detailed resource adequacy study that explored how all of the various resources can contribute towards meeting resource adequacy needs. And what you're seeing on this slide is ELCC curves. So ELCC is effective load carrying capability. You can think of it as effective capacity as a percentage of nameplate. For wind, solar, batteries, and demand response, and this is as a function of penetration. So as more wind and solar get added, their contribution that they make towards meeting the region's capacity needs declines. I think this is common everywhere. What's really interesting on this chart is if you look on the bottom left at the potential role of 6-hour battery storage, or it could be pumped hydro storage as well. What we found in the Pacific Northwest is that a little bit of that resource provides some pretty significant value, but it gets saturated very, very quickly. And that's maybe unique to the Northwest. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense because there's so much storage that's inherent in the hydro reservoir systems with large reservoirs that were built for flood control that the region is almost already saturated in terms of storage. So the amount of additional benefit that you get from adding 6-hour batteries, next to Lake Roosevelt, which is a 100-mile long reservoir that sits behind Grand Coulee, is pretty limited. And so that's important and unique to understand about the Northwest. This next chart shows you what a really difficult 10-day spell might look like in the Northwest on a system without firm zero carbon resources. The black line is the electric load. The blue area is hydro production. The green area is wind and solar production. The gray at the bottom is firm, and that's really the existing nuclear generation in the region. And what you see there is that on most days, even in this challenging 10-day winter stretch, on most days, we built this system to have a surplus of wind and solar generation. But what you find is that on day 5, the load picks up significantly because the cold front moves through the region. And at the same time, you have wind and solar declining as a result of that high pressure system that sits over the whole region. And you see there that by the middle of day 6, you have loss of load. And it's not just a little bit of lost load, it's as much as 40% of the region's load that can't be served during a particular moment because the batteries have been fully discharged and there's just no energy available to serve that load. And so this really illustrates the need for some kind of a dispatchable or firm source of clean energy to help dispatch and fill in those gaps. And I made this chart before the events of Texas last February, and it was always a little bit abstract, but I think if you can imagine those events, what happened in Texas, and you're trying to meet all of that load with wind and solar and batteries, and you can imagine that's just a very, very difficult challenge. So right away, we see the need for clean, firm, zero-emitting resources. So getting into the study results, this first chart here shows the renewables and batteries only scenario. On the bottom left, there are resources that are added in 2045 or cumulative through 2045 under the reference scenario with approximately 85% emission reductions. We didn't constrain the emissions in that case. under a 90% emission reduction case, 95% emission reductions, and then 100%, so zero emissions in the Pacific Northwest grid. The colors are, again, solar, wind, battery storage, et cetera. And you can see that significant amounts of renewables are added under this 95% case, almost 40 gigawatts that resources are added. But when you go between 95% and 100%, you see there's a significant jump in the amount of wind and solar that's needed to serve load reliably. And it's because of the dynamics that you saw in the previous slide, that there are hours and days in which you don't have very much wind and solar resource available. So if you're relying on wind and sun to meet the load during those days, you have to significantly oversize the system and build a lot more renewable energy than you would need on a normal day to make sure that it's there on the day when you need it the most. And you can see there that the cost of that system is significant, up to $8 billion per year, more than under the reference case. This chart just gives you a sense of why those costs are occurring as they do. The red wedge on top is curtailed renewable energy, and the orange wedge on the bottom is exported renewable energy. And so by the time you get to 100% renewables, you have way more energy than you need. You have to either curtail it or export it into an uncertain market in the rest of the West. And so that really is what drives the significant costs in those scenarios. So this chart then zeroes in on what happens if you start to make firm zero carbon resources available. So here we've added relicensing of the Columbia Generating Station to the reference case. So the build on the left is the one that you saw from the previous chart. On the right now, if you just add 1.2 gigawatts of baseload firm zero carbon resource, you're able to displace a lot of that wind and solar and battery storage investment. In fact, 1.2 gigawatts of nuclear avoids 14.4 gigawatts of non-firm wind, solar, and battery storage investment. And that's at a very significant cost savings. These are gross costs of $1.4 billion per year in 2045. So very significant benefits from adding that amount of nuclear. If you add even more, now here's the scenario where that was unconstrained. So we added as much small modular reactors, we added biomethane, we relicensed the Columbia Generating Station. So this is really a cost optimal scenario. It selected 5.8 gigawatts of firm generation, and that amount of generation was able to displace 81 gigawatts of wind, solar, and batteries with very, very significant cost savings, as I'm sure you can imagine. So just a very, very different system if you have these zero carbon firm resources available. Still adding an awful lot of wind and solar. Those are still the lowest cost resources just in terms of energy, but they're not available all the time. And having these resources that are available when the wind and solar aren't really supplements them, complements them, and adds to the system. So as I mentioned, a very significant cost savings from having these zero carbon firm resources available. Here's the cost curve in terms of incremental cost relative to the reference case as the carbon reduction goal gets more and more stringent. So first thing to notice in the Pacific Northwest, that very significant carbon reductions are available at a relatively low cost. But once you get close to 100%, that's when the cost curve becomes really steep if your tools are limited. And again, $8.6 billion incremental cost for a renewables and storage only system at 100% zero carbon as compared to the reference case. If you add just the Columbia Generating Station relicensing, that significantly reduces the cost, about $1.4 billion per year, as I mentioned before. You can notice that there's a noticeable difference even under 90 and 95% carbon reductions, but especially the closer you get to zero, the more important it is to have those firm resources. And now here's a case where you're adding CGS, but then also SMR technologies. And here you can see that this really is what unlocks the ability to achieve 100% zero carbon or 100% clean energy. You really can't get there. These upper scenarios really aren't practical. You need some form of scalable, firm zero carbon resource to be able to get there. And here we can see what happens to that cost curve. Now it's relatively flat all the way out through 100% if you have these resources available. Just a couple of more slides. I wanted to make sure everyone, or just assure you, I guess, that these findings aren't unique to that one study in the Pacific Northwest. Here's a snapshot from our New England Net Zero New England study. And here I want to refer you to that bar chart in the middle, which has very similar color coding with regard to the type of resources that were selected. We had a base scenario, and I think we're achieving 97% carbon emission reduction, somewhere along those lines in this scenario. It's not quite zero. Our base scenario doesn't have a nuclear available other than extension of the existing resources. So it picks a mix of onshore, offshore wind, distributed solar, utility solar, and batteries. If you make nuclear available, unlimited advanced nuclear, it selects 12 gigawatts of it, builds significantly less wind, solar, onshore, offshore, and batteries, and reduces energy bills by 8.5% relative to the base case. So similar findings in New England. This is a study that was funded by the Environmental Defense Fund and the Clean Air Task Force for California, where E3 did some analysis, as well as researchers from Stanford and Princeton. And similarly here, cases without clean firm capacity cost as much as twice as much as cases with clean firm capacity. Now I've highlighted here the case with nuclear. So even in California, having nuclear available results in very significant cost savings relative to a renewables only case. And then the final example I want to refer to is some work that we did with Xcel Energy in their upper Midwest service area, looking at resource in their IRP, looking at deep decarbonization scenarios. And here we were just looking at whether they ought to relicense or what the benefits might be from relicensing their existing Monticello and Prairie Island nuclear facilities. So the top case there is one without the nuclear relicensing. And we weren't going all the way to zero here. We were going to 85% carbon reductions, I think, which for their system is achievable at a very low cost of $21 per ton. But if you have the nuclear relicensing available, then that cuts the cost almost in half, down to $13 per ton. So our lesson here is that relicensing of those existing facilities provides significant benefits, but there is a limited budget for how much you want to spend on relicensing, at least if 85% carbon reductions is your goal. So just to summarize and conclude, we find from all of our studies that existing nuclear plants are difficult, they're expensive to replace, and the more aggressive the clean energy goal is, the more difficult and more expensive they are to replace. We find that clean firm power, some form of clean firm power, is essential for achieving a 100% clean energy system. There's lots of choices out there, a lot of theoretical resources that are available, a lot of resources in the R&D stage. I was really excited to see the announcement from Form Energy of their iron air battery that might achieve 100 hours of storage. That's a potential solution here. Hydrogen is another one, nuclear, carbon capture, etc. We find typically that when we have all of those resources available, our models want to select a portfolio that has all of them in it, because each of them has a slightly different role to play in a zero carbon system. Advanced nuclear can play a role in achieving deep carbon reductions, even in a region like the Pacific Northwest, which has huge advantages in terms of its robust grid, availability of high quality wind and solar resources, and a hydro asset base to help with the integration. I didn't talk too much about land use and transmission issues, but those are very real challenges to a very high renewable scenario. Those would also affect the clean firm technologies like hydrogen and very long duration storage that rely on surplus renewable energy for charging. We think that the land use and transmission challenges have not been really fully explored and are probably understated by a lot of the research that's out there, but we think they're going to be very, very significant. So nuclear is a resource that doesn't suffer from some of those same challenges, and we think can help, and that's another reason why we think it can play a role. And then lastly, I just want to note that these aren't just E3's conclusions. They're supported by an increasingly robust literature And I noted that the NREL LA 100 study also emphasized the need for clean, firm, zero carbon generation, the Princeton Net Zero study, and there are many, many others as well that are out there. So with that, again, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about our work, and happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Arnie. And I see in the chat, Ann Rendall, wait, I just lost it. She mentions that that is a great analysis. So we'll go ahead and get started with the first question I'll give to Arnie. It's from Jeff Merrifield in the chat. In your modeling, did you account for the fact that nuclear units are 60 to 80-year assets, whereas wind and solar only have roughly 20-year lifetimes and would need to be replaced multiple times during the same time frame as the nuclear unit?
Yes, so yes, in the sense that we assume different financing structures for nuclear as opposed to wind and solar. So for wind and solar, we would typically recover the costs over a 20 to 25-year time period through a PPA structure. For nuclear, we would use something more like a 40-year lifetime. I don't think we went to 60 or 80 years ever, but we would assume something more like a 40-year. So the annual cost is lower, and so the NPV is lower as the model selects those resources. I think it's probably fair to say that we don't really know what's going to happen to those solar and wind assets at the end of their lifetimes. I suspect that they will end up living much longer than 20 and 25 years. And even if they are replaced, that the sites will be valuable. And we've seen already some upgrades of existing wind sites with new turbines that increase the production from those facilities.
Okay, thank you for that. And we have several questions for Jesus in the chat. I'm going to read three of them to you because they all are somewhat related. The first question is, what interest have you gotten in Congress with this concept? The second question is, what federal policies will help enable this to be successful? And then the third set of questions begins, are you familiar with the microreactor and SMR study that is included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill? Do you see this as being useful, and what more needs to be done?
A lot of questions, but well, in terms of what can help Puerto Rico have a nuclear energy project, especially SMRs and microreactors, I think it depends more on the public perception in Puerto Rico. It has to be, people in Puerto Rico need to accept it when the local government is able to propose that project. Right now, the local government wants to do the studies and educate the people about how this will work in order to get that public perception agreement that yes, we want a nuclear project in Puerto Rico. In terms of the funding that is going to be available for that, I believe it could happen because Puerto Rico is part of the chain for the pharmaceutical industry that is very important to the United States. And those agreements between the Department of Energy and the local government of Puerto Rico, they can be reached, or even with the Department of Defense. It's just a matter of them to sit down and agree on this project. But the public opinion, like I said, it has a big impact into the decisions of the local government. And that's why we believe that the people in Puerto Rico need to be educated about these advanced reactors before proposing a full project, right?
Thank you. And I actually have a question on that. North Carolina, there's a bill in the General Assembly right now with respect to advanced nuclear within North Carolina. What lessons learned have you seen with your work in Puerto Rico that you can give to states looking at advanced nuclear?
I think that one of the things I will say is that people typically don't want to be the first, right? Of putting the nuclear reactor in their states or the territories. Puerto Rico obviously have their own political history about why they don't want it, but I think that's one aspect of it, and I think that the education and telling the people, hey, if we have this project, this is how much jobs we're going to generate. This is how this will help the community. And this is how the electricity in our community and our state will be better because we will have a reliable source of energy. And a lot of these things, typically they're not spoken to the people, and they get lost in the technicalities, right? And people don't understand them, and that's why probably nuclear energy doesn't have a lot of support, typically in other states that don't have nuclear. But I think it's important to teach the people about the challenges also of nuclear, especially the spent nuclear fuel, how the nuclear plants actually deal with it, because some people have misunderstanding about it. And I mean, you cannot get rid of that unless you educate the people about it.
Thank you for that. We have a couple of questions for Arnie. In your modeling, have you assumed the impact on environment and land use of disposing batteries and solar panels? And then a related question is, how might the analysis change with hydro versus climate change and drought?
Yeah, so both are great questions, and we haven't looked at all at what the potential costs might be of decommissioning of the wind and solar projects or the nuclear projects at the end of their lifetime. So that's just, we use the NREL ATV as our base for all those costs. So whatever's rolled up into those, I don't really think that there's a detailed analysis of the end of life. With regard to hydro and drought, also a great question. Our studies are based on historical hydro production, both the amount and the timing. We expect both of those to change going forward as we have more frequent droughts and earlier snow melts, and perhaps just less snow or less precipitation throughout the year. So both of those things would reduce hydro's capability of both providing clean energy, but also potentially of providing the flexibility services that they provide today to the Northwest that are so valuable. So as the hydro system is degraded by climate change, we expect the role of alternative resources to become more and more important over time.
Okay, thank you. And Chair Rendell has just sent in a question. Does your analysis factor in the cost of disposing of nuclear waste or holding it on site as an operating cost, or does your analysis just focus on cost to build?
That's a great question. I'm going to have to go and get back. I'm going to have to get back to Chair Rendell on that one. Holding, I assume that there's some of that is in the operations and maintenance cost that are in the NREL cost analysis. But again, I don't think that there's a detailed end of life analysis in there. And of course, the fate of all of the nuclear waste at reactors across the country is still kind of up in the air in terms of a permanent repository. So certainly new nuclear has all of the same disadvantages along those lines that the existing systems do.
And I actually have a related question with respect to your assumptions on the new natural gas build, because as you know, there's been some discussion about how long that natural gas will stay in service. And what were your assumptions around the life of the new gas?
So we would finance those over 20 years. In some cases, we've seen utilities use maybe up to 40 years in their IRPs for utility-owned asset. We've assumed more like a tolling agreement, a PPA with an IPP as our base. So 20 years, but the model will build those as needed. And in some areas of the country, and particularly the Northwest, as coal retires, they need firm capacity now. And if these alternative technologies aren't available, then the model builds gas as a way to keep the lights on over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years until the firm zero carbon substitutes are commercially available and have costs that are competitive. So we see a role for natural gas in the near term, unless and until a form of firm zero carbon energy is available.
Okay, thank you for that. And then this is a question to both of you and really everyone on the call. It's from Hisham. He asked, what is the all-in cost dollars per kilowatt for an SMR versus a micro reactor, if you know? If either of you know that answer off the top of your head, please share.
I was just looking those up. So we don't have the micro reactors in our study. We have SMRs. The NREL ATB in 2045 was $5,650 per kilowatt, with $100 per kilowatt year of fixed O&M. And when the new scale nth of a kind estimates were about 10% below that. So this just give you a sense. And that works out to, with our financing model that we used, on the order of $60 to $70 per megawatt hour, assuming a 90% capacity factor for the resource. So they're not, cheap, but they're not crazy expensive either. And we do see them playing a role, even though the energy cost may be twice as much as solar might, because it can produce when the energy is needed most. We see them playing a very valuable role.
Okay, thank you for that. And Jesus, could you talk about the resilience of advanced nuclear reactors with respect to extreme weather events or extreme events versus as compared to traditional electric generation?
Yes, I can, as a structural engineer, I have deal with that. Typical commercial plants, they are designed by the standard codes and regulations that we have. But nuclear plants, like for example, for earthquake, it requires a more stringent design. It requires the designer of the plant to have studies at the site. It requires to verify that there are no new faults near the zone, the area that you are building the plant, because all these things will affect the plant adversely. And that's why I believe nuclear is so resilient in terms of earthquakes that Puerto Rico is prone to them, and also to hurricanes. We have had hurricanes hitting the mainland in Florida, and the nuclear plants don't have any damage to them because of the design and the construction quality of the plant. And all of this is required by the NRC, by their code of regulations in Congress. So that's why we are proposing the nuclear plants. And in addition to that, they have a capacity factor of around 93%. So you add to the reliability of having that source of power every time during your grid, yeah.
Thank you for that. I see Chairman or Commissioner O'Donnell has come back up on the screen, so I think our Q&A time is over. I will say there's one more chat. It says, if possible, please share a link to the SMR study that is included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And Jasmine or Kira, if you could share that with the Nuclear Energy Partnership Group, that would be helpful. And I'll turn it back over to you, Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you, Commissioner Duffley, and thank you to our presenters. And I believe Kara just put that link up with the information from the bill, the infrastructure bill with nuclear tie and maybe something else, I'm not sure. But again, thank you, Jesus and Arnie, and the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy for supporting this webinar. Partnership members can join a quarterly partnership call on Friday, September 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. This brief members-only call will be an opportunity to share feedback with NARUC staff and fellow partnership members on the partnership's activities over the past few months, as well as comments on how upcoming partnership activities can align with your state's challenges and interests in nuclear power. Jasmine has already distributed call information to those on the NEP email list. Check NARUC's website for information on other upcoming activities, and please reach out to Kira and Jasmine at NARUC with any questions or feedbacks. Again, thank you for attending and have a great weekend.